It's the Joe Holka Show presented by Line Movement. If you're playing fantasy football, maybe a little bit of DraftKings and FanDuel, and you're kind of struggling, this is the time of the year where you can do one of two things. You can either accept defeat or you can get to work. And if I'm going to take that one step further, it's possible maybe you've had a couple nice hits on DraftKings or FanDuel either this year or the year before, but overall, your bankroll is just headed the wrong direction. You're looking to take things a little bit more seriously. Today, I have 15 tips to help save your daily fantasy football season on DraftKings and FanDuel. More of a deep dive into each position with some advanced concept, a little bit more of game theory involved also to help you get an edge, ultimately help you get to the top of the leaderboard. So if you find value in today's video, I would love it if you consider subscribing to the channel. At the very least, do me a solid, toss a like on this video when you get a chance. Be sure and join us on stream every Monday and Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time, also Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Until then, let's get into today's tips. Efficiency over volume at the quarterback position. And we're going to hear a lot of people talk about yards per attempt, but I do think the best metric to understand how a quarterback himself is performing, not the team, but for DFS purposes, is going to be completion percentage over expected. And that's just basically the same as completion percentage, but it is adjusted for depth. And you can get that off of Next Gen Stats as well for free. They do a little bit more of a robust version, which takes into account how close to the sideline the receiver was, definitely harder throws, of course, and also the separation that the receiver had at the point of which the quarterback released the ball, things like that. And I do think that the truth, in the end, it almost always comes back to depth of target from a fantasy perspective, how deep the pass was downfield. Guys that can complete more passes than you would expect at all depths of the field are typically the best quarterbacks in the league, and that's almost always true. Yards per attempt is also very good. It's a higher yards per attempt typically means that he's completing passes downfield, so it does pick up a bit of that signal also. But in general, I like to look at how deep a quarterback is targeting his receivers. Then you kind of have to ask yourself, how deep are the type of routes his receivers are running? And obviously, that's really important when you're trying to figure out how to stack your quarterback with his wide receiver or his receiving weapon. Because if you have a quarterback who likes to throw short, but you pair him with a super elite deep threat wide receiver, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to just coexist perfectly. He may not be patient enough to allow for even a really good deep threat to get open. So that's the kind of analysis I think has a lot of value. Be thoughtful with how you're using Vegas lines and selecting quarterbacks on DraftKings and FanDuel, because it definitely matters. You're going to see projections across the industry that weigh Vegas lines heavily at the position. It's one of the best ways to predict fantasy scoring for sure. The problem is everyone's using the same information, so I don't know if there's really truly an edge from it anymore. You definitely need to incorporate it, especially if you're building your own projections, but it needs to be a piece of the puzzle, not just an end-all be-all, especially if you're primarily a tournament player. The thing that you can do is look at Vegas lines when they first come out, observe how they move throughout the week when we get some sharp bets coming in. Just from a fantasy perspective, the range of outcomes is never going to be near as large at the quarterback position as it is for some other positions. It's not necessarily kicker by any means, but it's close in a lot of ways. In some of the other positions, I do think that there's a larger edge in trying to fade Vegas lines, because then you can leverage ownership in a completely different way. So it's almost less effective overall to even use ownership leverage at the quarterback position. I think it's better to use it in terms of stacks overall, but you'll see a lot of people just pay down consistently at the quarterback position or place a higher emphasis on running quarterbacks, that sort of thing. Because from a Vegas perspective, one of the things that you can do and use Vegas lines for is just to figure out where the public is going to be at in terms of those stacks, maybe how you can potentially benefit from doing things a little bit different in that stack if you still like the game a lot, or maybe just how you can do things differently in roster construction as a whole. Every week is definitely different. Pay more attention to if a quarterback is going to see pressure versus just using matchup-based metrics like DVOA, fantasy points against, whatever it is. Those are the type of things that I was trying to at least get away from a little bit more this past season and the year before. So I transitioned to focusing a lot more on pressure. So it's one of those things that's going to affect efficiency more at the quarterback position more than almost anything else. And we know that efficiency is what truly matters if we're trying to predict quarterback fantasy points. So when you're evaluating if a quarterback is going to be a decent play on DraftKings and FanDuel, what you're really trying to do is see how he's going to be doing in that upcoming game. That's what really matters from our perspective in DFS. So what you want to do is go back and see how that quarterback has performed when he wasn't under pressure. How efficient was he? Because that's what's more predictive. Like, so Patrick Mahomes, that's he's a good example. He's incredible in the pocket and out of the pocket over the last couple seasons. I would say that the fact that he was good in the pocket is probably the best predictor of how he's going to be doing going forward. Out of the pocket, he's amazing. Don't get me wrong. Some of those throws he made across his body, no looks, all of that stuff. But counting on that stuff to happen over and over and over again is less of a sure thing than counting on a guy who's actually making plays in structure and kind of hitting those reads that he's been taught to do. So if he can do that at a high level, he's likely to continue doing it. Another thing you can do is discount the pressure stats and weight higher in the stats where quarterbacks are not under pressure. That's really a better indication of their real talent. Target running quarterbacks on both DraftKings and FanDuel. So one of the things that we've talked about a lot over the last couple of years is building in that rushing floor whenever possible. And one thing that probably doesn't get talked about enough is the ceiling that's provided from some of these guys. We saw it a lot last year in terms of Lamar Jackson, so it's something that people are talking about even more. So you get kind of that 40 to 50 yards on the ground, just a nice floor. The upside of maybe running a touchdown in always is nice. But the thing that people don't talk about, what happens when these guys throw 2 or 3 touchdowns along the way? You end up hitting that ceiling that a lot of these guys like Matt Ryan can never really match. So I think that just really trying to focus on those guys first, regardless of the matchup, is something that I've been trying to focus on. Even someone like Kyler Murray, someone that doesn't even throw the ball deep very often, you get that nice floor on the ground. It really just kind of gives you that nice floor depending on the pricing. It's really a spot where it kind of depends on what type of contest you're playing. But I think if you're playing cash games, it's something we've talked about a lot, just trying to build in that rushing floor. That's something that isn't really that hard to kind of come across in terms of really the content space. But what about small field tournaments? Really building in that floor first. And one thing that's really nice about a small field is you don't really need to fully stack in those to get to the top of, say, a 100-person tournament. You can single stack, and I'm totally willing to single stack some of these running quarterbacks. I don't usually do the naked quarterback option, though a lot of people have talked about that also. I do think that if you're going to run out a guy again to bring it back full circle, a guy like Matt Ryan, who's not going to give you anything on the ground, those are scenarios where I would have a hard time not double stacking them. So I think that that's one of the things that probably isn't talked about enough. So if we're going to target running quarterbacks, I think we just have to be thoughtful about our contests first and kind of figure it out from there. Target defenses that struggle to defend deep passes with quarterbacks who are willing to chuck it deep. And definitely the opposite is okay as well, but we'll get to that in a second. You know, I'm not quite defense doesn't matter by any means, but I don't really find a ton of value in matchup-based metrics like DVOA, fantasy points against, especially at the quarterback position for DraftKings and FanDuel. Even early in the year, we don't really know exactly what these defenses are yet. So I like to try and let things settle down a little bit. But even then, I'm focusing on the tails primarily, teams that are extremely poor one way or the other, or extremely strong one way or the other in terms of short passes versus deep passes. So at quarterback, I care a lot more about a rushing floor, things like yards per attempt, completion percentage over expected, really trying to target efficiency and that rushing floor whenever possible. But on the subject of throwing deep, one thing that I do look at is how defenses defend short passes versus deep passes overall. This is normally something, again, that I reserve for about halfway through the season, and it certainly isn't perfect, but I do think that there's some value in at least using a descriptive metric like this as more of a tiebreaker at times, because at the tails, I think there's some teams that are especially poor at defending deep passes. If stars align and kind of the opposite quarterback likes to throw deep, by all means. I think the opposite is also true. So I'm looking for potentially a stacking partner with my quarterback. In a perfect world, I'd be able to adjust that option with the type of depth that that defense struggles with the most. So I think I'm more kind of looking at it in terms of stacks and really trying to just tailor those for the matchup in particular. Before we get back to the tips to save your daily fantasy football season, I want to remind everyone about the community that we're currently building on Discord through Patreon. So for just $1 per month, 25 cents per week, you get access to our exclusive conversation, this chat that we have been building with over 1,000 people already in there, eager and willing to learn and improve. So definitely some trash talk along the way with our weekly DraftKings contest. That's been a huge success. We have some prizes going out each and every week through Amazon gift cards. Going to continue to increase those the more people we get in here. It's been a ton of fun, whether it's DFS, season long, fantasy football in general, sports betting. We're just building a place where anyone can come in, contribute ideas, help each other stay up to date throughout the week, whether it's news, whether it's roster construction, ton of great conversation going on in there. Of course, I do an exclusive live stream for Patreons only each week that is not broadcasted anywhere else but Discord. It's directly before kickoff. So if you're interested in joining up, sign up at patreon.com/Joe Holka. There's also a link in the description as well. Hope you consider becoming a Holkamaniac, and just looking forward to seeing you in the chat very soon. But for now, let's get back to the tips. Pass catching running backs against teams that struggle to defend in that area, because I think overall this whole conversation is really interesting. Descriptive metrics, matchups, whatever you want to call them. It's kind of tough for me at the running back position because we know that volume is everything. And I think people probably think of the Atlanta defense, that whole narrative for like the last few years that people always want to talk about how the Falcons give up a ton to pass catching running backs. And while that may be true, and I'm certainly willing to acknowledge teams that skew further towards the tails as either very strong, very poor, like bottom 3-4 in the league, top 3-4 in the league. Maybe that matters from a matchup perspective, but I think that there are teams that are more effective at passing to their running backs on the other side of it, and that might be what really matters. So like, let's talk about a team like the Chiefs. Andy Reid, probably better than any coach in the NFL at getting his running backs into space. That's part of the reason that Kansas City backs have consistently been some of the best performers in my rushing expectation methodology, because even if a team doesn't do it a lot, but when they do, it's hyper efficient. Like the way that they design the plays or scheme those players, the ball is just especially awesome. Maybe that's when you can kind of rely on those backs when they do get their chances. They're probably going to have some good numbers. It's more than defense doesn't matter. I'm closer to that than I think some people, but I'm not fully there. But in DFS, we're still trying to beat others first versus project only fantasy points. So using descriptive metrics like matchups or teams that struggle to defend running backs in the passing game, etc., it's certainly something that some people have been able to make profitable. It's just not something that I've added to my toolbox as a primary decision point for DFS. Even if hashtag running backs don't matter, I do believe that breaking tackles is a skill in itself. It's absolutely something that sticks with the running back. We saw it with Dalvin Cook, Kareem Hunt, Nick Chubb. They were all great tackle breakers coming out of college, and they were named great tackle breakers in the NFL. It's a skill you can count on. The problem is the distribution of outcomes for a rushing play is just so narrow. That's the problem. That's why running back is more of a replaceable position than others. If a running back can break a tackle, he's going to get more yards. That's a good thing. The problem is it usually is only going to be another yard or two more, because once you're done breaking that tackle, you've usually evaded just with that one guy you're supposed to, and another defender is there shortly after to make a play. So unless it's blocked just incredibly and you're at the second level with tons of open field in front of you, maybe then it turns into a big play. But more often than not in the NFL, running plays are just very, very small range of outcome plays overall. Another thing I know some analysts have looked into is if guys that break more tackles get more opportunity, and that's definitely not always true. In fact, it's rarely true, even with analytics looking more and more as a secure footing in the league. I do think that things like elusiveness rating at PFF is one of those stats that definitely is a lot more sticky at running back than some other metrics. But one of the things that I always want to say and bring this home, volume is what matters. And to me, volume through the air, even for running backs, is always going to be more valuable for both fantasy and DFS. When you're choosing running backs to roster on DraftKings and FanDuel, look at total yards per game over the last 4. Just trying to look at yards from scrimmage, because actually it's one of the more predictable forms of measurement we have at the running back position, where we know volume is everything. We're always kind of placing a high emphasis on touches, and that's exactly what you should be doing. But total yards from scrimmage per game over the last 4 or so can really help you back in to some players like Alvin Kamara a few years back, a player who was definitely running hot as far as his efficiency, his big plays, that sort of thing. But if it leads you in today's DFS to lower ownership, but at least comparable upside, it can kind of be something that really helps you from a DraftKings and FanDuel roster discussion. I do think that it's one of the more powerful predictors that we have for performance, even if you're using some longer term samples as well. And the main reason you'd want to do that is really just to eliminate games where there was injury, which is completely random, and it gives you some kind of measurement to not only that player's obvious skill, but also the efficiency in that number, because it's mainly just volume. It's what Zeke is. Zeke's a guy who's just elite at getting volume from the Cowboys. So you'll see that in his per game yardage total. He just consistently gets the rock, whether it's touches through the air or on the ground. Taking per game averages is actually quite good. It's actually better than taking fantasy point averages because those include touchdowns, which are also pretty random. So I would highly recommend leaning towards yardage per game totals. Whatever target touch game totals you might come up with is definitely something you can add to your arsenal. Use them in addition to your touch projections at running back. There's not one perfect metric that will lead you towards the best wide receiver plays on DraftKings and FanDuel every week, but Whopper's pretty close. Shout out to my boy Josh Hermsmeyer at airyards.com. Whopper is essentially a weighted opportunity rating for wide receivers. It takes into effect share of air yards, team air yards, and their share of targets, combines them all together, weighs them correctly, and says, here are the top targets on the team. Here are the guys that are getting the most opportunity. And airyards.com, you can basically just sort by team, kind of do different sample sizes if you want the entire season, if you want the last 4 games, whatever it is. It just gives you a perfect list of guys who are seeing valuable opportunity. And that's what you want in DFS at the wide receiver position, where Whopper is really helpful. It's for players like Golden Tate or anyone that sees relatively short targets. And let's just say that a deeper threat is alongside him. For the sake of this argument, let's bring it back to when Golden Tate was in Detroit and Marvin Jones is on the other side of him. Was the guy that got relatively further targets downfield. And when Golden Tate had more targets overall, but the leverage behind those targets that Jones got was much, much higher, their actual value was about equal. And if you look at just targets, you would think that Tate was the guy to own, but actually they're pretty equivalent in terms of what they were getting on a game-by-game basis, or the leverage you got in DFS was actually probably skewing more towards Marvin Jones. There were lots of games where Jones actually put up some good numbers. So that's just a way of figuring out which players on the team is the wide receiver 1, who's the wide receiver 2, and then you kind of look at other guys with similar whoppers and you can say, what's their total fantasy points at this point? And if there are guys that are well below but have similar amount of opportunity, they're probably good candidates to have a spike game in the future, which can always help you get to the top of GPPs if you land on a guy that's much lower owned but still seeing really nice opportunity. Doesn't mean you have to just take crazy flyers on guys not seeing volume. That's really not what we're trying to do here. Focus on rostering wide receivers who stack up valuable opportunities each game, so deeper targets over the actual results of those previous opportunities, because you're going to watch a guy get 5 deep targets, drop all of them. If one of them was caught, maybe it's a touchdown, something like that. But, maybe the ref blew the call or he was pushed out of bounds at the last second, something like that. Those things aren't indicative of the player's skill. It was just bad luck. And beyond that, there are players who get looks, fail, but honestly, those looks are more predictive than the failure itself is predictive. Football is hard, guys. There's lots of reasons you may not come down with a pass. And if you only get 5 or 6 looks a game, like a lot of wide receivers out there, what's actually more important for projecting the future is that you got those looks. So you want to get a list of wide receivers each and every week that have been getting tons of opportunity, but haven't been putting up tons of points. The opportunity itself is likely to continue, where when variance finally kind of hits their side, they're going to put up a huge number, but they're also probably going to be lower owned in tournaments because people are just going to be fading them due to that recent performance. There's still tons of people out there that are only looking at box scores and they just think those players are bad, but those are the type of players that could potentially help you win a tournament on DraftKings and FanDuel. To use shorter term sample sizes at wide receiver, because there's definitely a few other metrics you can use besides weighted opportunity rating. We'll talk about those in a minute, but sample size is still very important, especially at wide receiver on DraftKings and FanDuel. And while we're on the subject of it, if you're using something like Whopper at airyards.com, from a DFS perspective, I'm using a 3 to 4 week rolling sample typically at wide receiver. It's really the most predictive because then you're not picking up stuff that happened in the first 3 weeks of the season. If you're in like week 9 or 10, something like that, you really start to lose that edge if you have those kind of spike spots that maybe happen in week 1 or 2. Things can change a lot in terms of volume. So understanding that has actually been like the way that I would try and find guys that haven't been getting that production yet, but have still been seeing those valuable opportunities downfield. You really want to be able to see those peaks and valleys in a player's performance so you can time the spikes better for GBPs, hopefully get lower ownership on some of these wide receivers. So 3 to 4 weeks is what I found is a pretty decent number. Obviously, you're going to have to go in and adjust things manually for bye weeks, but it's definitely worth the effort. If you have access to yards per route run, a pro football focus metric, definitely think I would use that. Also, really solid metric overall. Ton of predicted value that can help you uncover good plays at wide receiver. And the last one, and we talked a little bit about it at running back, but total yards from scrimmage per game over that same shorter wide receiver time frame. I think there's comparable predictiveness to things like targets if you're using that, believe it or not, and it can really help you back into some more efficiency plays. Like Tyreek Hill always comes to mind a couple of years back when he wasn't seeing near as much volume, but he was still making big plays consistently. So sometimes efficiency gets a bad rap in the DFS space, but if it leads me to players, wide receivers specifically, seeing valuable types of volume, albeit less volume overall, I'm still interested in kind of capturing that lower ownership if it doesn't compromise too much of my ceiling. Stop looking at wide receiver cornerback matchups when you're trying to figure out if a guy's in play for DraftKings and FanDuel at the wide receiver position, because the reality is it's just not near as important as volume. Overall, that's what we always want to skew towards, guys that are going to be seeing valuable targets downfield. Honestly, these wide receiver cornerback matchups, they're going to draw a ton of kind of talk throughout the industry. It's going to draw a lot of where the narratives go in terms of ownership, all of that. But I kind of stopped paying attention to this about 2 or 3 years ago now, and it's definitely done a lot for my game. I think that there's just not a ton of predictive value in it overall. There's certainly going to be scenarios where there's going to be a shadow situation where maybe it's a really tough matchup for the wide receiver. But in those type of situations, a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, he can still win in any matchup. What about talking about how it's just a bad matchup for the cornerback? People want to talk about how it's a horrible matchup for these elite wide receivers, but I think that the other side is actually far more important. We've seen guys like Michael Thomas make their way through tough matchups before and just absolutely smash at low ownership because no one wants to go there in DFS. I think as a community, we're kind of past this at some point, but I still think it's something that we need to talk about. Don't even put it in your spreadsheets. Don't even look at it. It really doesn't matter. Coaches can scheme these guys away from shadow coverage. They can scheme these guys away from some of the top cornerbacks at times. Just get the ball in their hands in different types of plays if they really want to. It's not something that should be driving our decision making overall. Pay attention to routes run at tight end. There's definitely a few other ways to find hidden gems at the position for DraftKings and FanDuel, but one of the first things I do each and every week in my tight end research is look at how many routes run they have over the last 4 or 5 games. If you have Pro Football Focus, you could look at how many blocking snaps they have versus how many in-route snaps they have. So you're really trying to find the guy that's off the radar. Sometimes you're just trying to back into someone that could be extremely cheap, maybe just undervalued, or maybe just a really low-owned pivot in GPPs. There's tight ends that don't get a ton of targets, but they're very efficient with the ones they do. And if they're getting more of their snaps in route, that's promising for their future performance. So whether it's a low-owned GPP play like I was talking about before, or a sleeper in season long, those are the things that can kind of give you an edge at a volatile position for sure. So it's one of those ones where you want that move tight end role while also being good enough to stay on the field to block for all situations. So yards per route run is a little bit different. I think this is kind of where I'm trying to find a little bit of upside. Someone like Mark Andrews actually has a yards per route run similar to some wide receivers at times, whereas someone like Zach Ertz, his yards per route run carries a little bit less upside, even though his volume is super secure. So when I'm looking for upside, that's definitely something that I'm looking for kind of at the high end of tight ends. But I think as far as some other tiebreakers, you guys know me by this point, I rarely pay attention to matchups outside of just the tails. Top 3 or 4 teams, bottom 3 or 4 teams against a position or certain depth of the field. I think that's important also, but I do use them as tiebreakers. As long as you're not starting them with your process, I do think that that's fine. I think that if you've narrowed it down to like 2 or 3 guys that you really like and you found a defense that tends to give up a lot to tight ends, then maybe there's a reason for it. Prioritize high team totals at the tight end position when making rosters for DraftKings and FanDuel. Just think about it this way. It's almost always going to be a lower volume situation where tight ends are going to see less targets than wide receivers. Touchdowns can just heavily impact the entire week at this position. So I think that one thing that, just to be extremely clear, we're not targeting touchdowns per se. Obviously, that's a pretty volatile strategy. More, you just want to be putting yourself in the situation where if touchdowns are going to be scored overall from the team, you can benefit from that. So I do think that it's one spot where obviously target share is still extremely important. You'll see some of those type of things right away for the elite guys. So from a DFS perspective, part of the reason that people have gotten comfortable or in the habit of paying up for guys like Kelsey, Kittle, Ertz, and strong matchups is that times these guys are seeing the volume of elite wide receivers with significant roles in the red zone on top of that. They just aren't priced necessarily like elite wide receivers all the time. What I look for when rostering a defense on DraftKings and FanDuel, because for me, it's all about trying to get passing attempts on the other side of the ball, and it's about trying to get pressure. Some quarterbacks struggle a little bit more than others while under pressure, and from a Vegas perspective, in a perfect world, I would want to have a favorable game script. So favorites, overall, home favorites, if possible. We're really trying to attack passing attempts on the other side of the ball, but at the same time, I'm really not scared of these high Vegas team totals on the other side of the ball, because I just don't really care if they get scored on. I don't care if my defense gives up points. That's really not how the scoring is set up anyway. I want turnovers. I want pass attempts, because that's what benefits you the most with the way scoring is set up. So in terms of pressure, almost all the signal that I found in the research that I done was related to the offensive line. So if you have a bad offensive line playing against a good defensive line, that's a really bad situation for your quarterback, and that's definitely something to pay attention to. But if you have a good on good, basically, a good offensive line versus a good defensive line, it's still the offensive line that usually wins out in that situation. So there's definitely going to be guys like Aaron Donald, for example. They're difference makers no matter what you do. That's definitely going to be an exception in terms of talent. But in general, I think the way that you should view DST is to focus most of your attention on the offensive line that they are facing. We haven't talked a ton about pace yet, but pace is extremely important to me across the board, basically for any position. Like volume is going to be extremely important for DFS, but from a defense perspective, I still want opportunities. I want opportunities for turnovers. I want to target quarterbacks that take a lot of sacks. I want to target quarterbacks that throw a lot of picks, but I also want the opportunity for those things to happen. They have to have passing attempts. There has to be plays overall. Hopefully you got something out of today's video. It's basically an accumulation of all that I've learned on the high stakes scene of DraftKings and FanDuel for the last 5 or 6 years. If you did find some value today, I'll request one last time you do me a favor and toss a like on this video. Consider subscribing and obviously check out linemovement.com. Let me know in the comments if you have any additional strategy related questions. Would love to hear from you. Also, the Joe Holka Show is on Apple Podcasts, so the best way to support what I'm doing here overall is just by leaving me a rating and review. Consider joining us in our Discord chat through Patreon. And I don't have all the answers, guys, but I'm willing to kind of work through this with you guys together. Hopefully see you in the chat sometime on a live stream. Again, those are on Monday and Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Also Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. I'll see you then.